What happens when betrayal becomes deadly? What does it take to push a man to the edge? To turn his love into rage? To shatter the very foundation of trust he's built his life on? Imagine the woman you vowed to spend your life with, the woman you trust more than anyone, turning out to be hiding something so deeply destructive. It threatens to destroy everything in its path that it's a question that most of us can't even begin to answer. Yet for some, it becomes an unthinkable reality. This is the story of a man who thought he had everything until one night he learned the most shocking truth of his life. A story that begins with a simple, unassuming evening, an evening that, like any other, started with routine. But that night would bring about a discovery so devastating. It would not only tear apart the life he thought he knew, but also unravel the fragile bonds of his family. In that one moment, everything he held dear, the love, the trust, the commitment, was shattered by the dark weight of a secret. It wasn't just the affair. No, it was far worse. What started as a suspicion, a simple question hanging in the air, slowly turned into an undeniable truth. A truth that lay in the form of a single message, a message that would forever change everything. Can you imagine the gut-wrenching realization that the woman you loved, who had promised to stand by your side through thick and thin, had not only betrayed you, but had kept the most shocking secret from you? This was no ordinary affair. No, this was a revelation that would go much deeper, beyond the walls of a broken marriage. It was a truth that would shake the very core of his family and leave him questioning everything he had ever believed about his life. First, it didn't make sense. How could he have been so blind? How could he not have seen the signs? But when the truth hit him, when he saw the message, the one that exposed the lie, he knew the world as he knew it had collapsed in that instant. And yet, the secret wasn't just about a wife's betrayal. There was something else, something darker, something more destructive. Because hidden within that web of lies, there was another secret that he hadn't even imagined. A truth that involved the child he had raised, the daughter he had loved. How could the man who had given everything, his heart, his soul, his life, have been so wrong about his own flesh and blood? It was more than betrayal. It was a nightmare, one that he couldn't wake from. A nightmare so deep, so consuming, that it drove him to the brink. And just like that, in a moment of blind rage, of heartbreak and disbelief, the truth he uncovered sparked something irreversible, something deadly. When the veil was lifted and the darkness was revealed, everything shattered. The wife he had trusted, the daughter he had loved, the family he had built, all of it was built on lies. The discovery that had set it all in motion would lead to an unimaginable tragedy, one that no one could have ever predicted. The truth would expose more than a marriage destroyed. It would destroy lives. It would leave a trail of devastation no one could recover from. So, the question remains, how far can love, anger, and betrayal push a man before he loses everything? The truth he uncovered would tear apart not just the family, but also the man himself. A story of revenge, heartbreak, and consequences that would echo for years. What happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and family. Stay with me as we delve into the tragic tale of shattered trust. Meet the family at the heart of this tragedy. On the surface, they were just like any other family, the kind that appeared to have it all: the perfect house, the stable lives, the warm smiles. But like so many things in life, appearances can be deceiving, and the truth that would soon surface was far from the idyllic life they projected. 40 years old, Mark had spent most of his life dedicated to building a career and a family. A man of quiet strength, he was well respected in his community, a successful businessman who ran his own thriving logistics company. He had always prided himself on being dependable, trustworthy, a pillar in his family's life. But underneath the surface, there was something more complex. A man who struggled with unspoken fears, insecurities, and deep, buried emotions. Mark wasn't the type to open up easily, to share his worries or doubts. Instead, he channeled everything into his work, trying to provide a stable, secure life for his family. And his love for his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Lucy, was the one thing he felt was solid in an often unpredictable world. He had always thought of Claire as his rock, the woman who stood by him through thick and thin. Little did he know, Claire's facade was as fragile as the walls of their picture-perfect home. Claire Wilson. At 38 years old, Claire was everything Mark had ever wanted in a partner. Beautiful, charismatic, and successful in her own right. A former college sweetheart, Claire had a way of lighting up a room with her smile, her laughter, her warmth. She had always been the heart of their home, the one who organized the family's life with grace and poise. But Claire had a secret, a dark secret that had been growing for months, then years, a secret she had carefully hidden from Mark, convinced that the life she had built was worth the lies. The affair had begun innocently enough, a fleeting attraction to someone she met through work, but it had spiraled quickly into something far deeper, more dangerous than she ever imagined. And though she loved Mark, she felt trapped by the choices she had made, the guilt, the fear, the weight of what she was hiding from him. It was all too much to bear. Yet she continued to play her part as the perfect wife, mother, and partner. But behind her eyes was something else, something Mark would never see until it was far too late. That Claire's betrayal wasn't just about another man. It was something more profound, something that would tear apart the fabric of their family. And that secret was something Mark would stumble upon when it was already too late. Then there was Lucy at 89 years old. Lucy was the embodiment of innocence, the apple of Mark's eye, his pride and joy. She was everything he had worked for, everything he wanted to protect. Her laughter filled their home with warmth, and her hugs were the only comfort Mark needed after a long day of work. Mark had always been incredibly protective of her, and she, in turn, adored him. They shared a special bond, a father who had never questioned his love for his daughter, and a daughter who thought her father could do no wrong. But Lucy's innocence would soon become part of the heartbreaking story. It was a secret she didn't know, a truth she couldn't possibly understand, a secret that would make the ultimate betrayal all the more devastating. For in the moment Mark discovered the truth, it would shatter everything, not just his marriage, but his relationship with his daughter as well. The home that Mark and Claire had built together was a grand one, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, its sprawling lawn lined with beautiful trees. The house stood as a symbol of their success, the white picket fence and neat, manicured garden the perfect setting for their picture-perfect life. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, with family photos on the walls, comfortable furniture, and the hum of normal family life. It was a place where Mark and Claire would gather with Lucy after a long day, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. But what Mark didn't know was that these walls, these rooms, were full of lies. The house became a prison for Claire, a place where the truth was suffocated beneath the weight of her own guilt. And for Mark, it was a place where love and rage would collide in the most violent of ways at first glance. They seemed like any other family, the kind that made you believe in love, in stability, in the idea that everything could be perfect. But behind the smiles, behind the Sunday dinners, and the quiet conversations, there was a storm brewing, betrayal, heartbreak, rage. Mark never saw it coming. How could he have? His wife was his partner, the mother of his child. He had built everything for her, for their family, only to discover that she had built a world of lies in return. For Claire, the guilt was unbearable, but she never imagined that the truth would come crashing down in such a devastating way. And for Lucy, the tragic discovery would tear apart the only family she had ever known. This was more than just a broken marriage. This was the unraveling of a life, a family, and a man who would lose everything he thought he had. And it all began with one message. The message that would expose Claire's secret, the message that would destroy their world. For years, Mark and Claire had what appeared to be a perfect life, a life others might envy. Their home was the picture of suburban bliss. Their daughter, Lucy, was the joy of their world. But beneath the surface, something was quietly eating away at their family. It was the kind of thing no one could see coming. The subtle cracks in a seemingly perfect marriage, the slow erosion of trust, the nagging feeling that something just wasn't right. Mark knew Claire, but he didn't truly know her anymore. That it had started innocently enough, or at least it appeared so. A couple small arguments about nothing in particular, long hours at work, household responsibilities, a few too many late nights. It's the kind of thing that happens in any marriage, right? But then, those moments began to grow. They became more frequent, more heated. Claire started spending more time away from home. Work meetings that ran late, late-night calls, dinner plans that Mark was left out of. And when he asked her about it, she always had a convenient excuse. Always. But there was something in her eyes, something in her tone that made him pause. Was it just stress? Or was it something else? Tension built, yet it went unnoticed by the people around them. Friends and family who only saw what Mark and Claire wanted them to see. A couple in their 30s, working hard to build a future, a family. But that future was beginning to crumble, not because of the arguments or stress, but because of something far darker, something Mark wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just the distance between them. It was the way Claire's behavior began to change, like the slow turning of a key in a lock that Mark couldn't see. And then, there were the little things. The unexplained things. Small, seemingly insignificant moments that added up over time. Mark noticed the extra charges on their credit card, dinner receipts from fancy restaurants. Nothing outrageous, but it was the timing that caught his attention. He noticed Claire's phone was always locked. The screen never left unlocked around him. But what really set the alarm bells ringing was the night he came home early from a business trip and found her phone on the kitchen counter. Normally, she'd be glued to it, texting or scrolling through her social media. But tonight, the phone was face up, the screen lit with a single text message. A message that would change everything. The message read, "I miss you. Can't wait to see you tonight. I'll make it worth your while." Mark's heart stopped. He picked up the phone, his hands trembling. It wasn't just a message. It was a confession, one that confirmed his worst fears. But the shock didn't come from the words. It came from the name attached to the message, someone Mark knew, a name that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The realization hit him like a freight train. Claire had been seeing someone else, but that wasn't the only secret Claire had been hiding. No, the infidelity wasn't the end of it. As Mark dug deeper, the truth became more horrifying with each new revelation. It wasn't long before he began to notice other small, seemingly insignificant details. His wife's sudden interest in her appearance, the way she would come home late with no explanation. And then there was the strange and unspoken tension between Claire and their daughter, Lucy. Mark began to wonder. Was something more going on than just a betrayal? Was his daughter, the little girl he had raised with so much love, somehow caught up in this? The answer would come much later, but not before it broke him. The first real clue, the one that made Mark question everything, came in the form of a simple financial transaction. One that should never have been made in the first place. It wasn't much, just a small, odd deposit. One that Mark, in his routine check of the household finances, noticed was paid to a different name. But it wasn't just the name that made his blood run cold. It was the context. The same name he had seen attached to Claire's message. A name that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was at that moment, when everything began to unravel, that the real horror set in. Mark didn't know where to turn or who to trust. He couldn't confront Claire without risking everything. But he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut, either. The more he found, the more certain he became. There was more to this story. And it wasn't just about an affair. It was something far worse. But the worst part? The worst part was what Claire hadn't told him about Lucy. Mark wasn't just learning about his wife's betrayal. He was learning that the little girl he'd raised with such love wasn't even his own. The paternity test, a secret Claire had kept from him for years, would prove it. Lucy, his sweet daughter, wasn't his biological child. What could possibly hurt more than that? How could Mark, a man who had given his all, who had invested everything into this family, ever come to terms with this devastating truth? And yet, the truth was there, staring him in the face, in a collection of little hints and clues that now seemed so obvious. If only he had known to look. The stage was set. Claire's web of lies was unraveling faster than she could control. The secrets were out, and Mark was left with nothing but rage, heartbreak, and betrayal. Mark stood on the precipice of an unknown future. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. His world had shattered in a single moment, and now he had to decide, what would he do with the truth? The moment Mark discovered the truth, that moment would be the one he'd never forget. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Mark had always prided himself on being level-headed, someone who could handle anything that life threw his way. But as he stood there in the silence of his kitchen, staring at Claire's phone, his entire world came crashing down around him. The text message was still on the screen, as if taunting him. Words that he had hoped to never see, but deep down had always feared. I miss you. Can't wait to see you tonight. I'll make it worth your while. It was from someone Mark didn't know, but he knew enough. The name on the screen, it haunted him. It wasn't just any stranger. It was someone he knew, someone who had been in and out of their lives. A friend of Claire's, someone who had always been around, someone he'd never suspected could betray him in this way. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, each beat faster than the last. His eyes scanned the message over and over again, as if somehow hoping the words would change. But they didn't. They stayed the same, cold, unmistakable, real. How long had this been going on? How long had Claire been keeping this secret from him? How could she, after everything they had built together, betray him so completely? And what about Lucy? Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But the more he thought, the more his anger and confusion swirled together. The woman he loved, the woman he trusted, had been lying to him for months. Or longer. How much longer had she been hiding this? He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at the phone, caught in the whirlwind of disbelief. His body was numb, as if the weight of the truth had knocked the breath right out of him. But as the anger began to rise in him, the cold realization set in that this wasn't just about an affair. This was a lie that went deeper, much deeper. In a flash, his mind raced to the one thing that had kept him awake at night for weeks. The possibility that Lucy, his beloved daughter, wasn't even his own. The financial transaction he had found, the strange deposit made to that same name, was the final piece of the puzzle. The pieces clicked together with a chilling finality. His daughter wasn't his. And Claire had known. She had known the truth for years. The anger he felt now was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the very foundation of his life, his identity, and his family being pulled out from under him. His whole world, the people he had loved and trusted, had turned into a cruel deception. And the weight of that betrayal was unbearable. The confrontation came quickly. With the phone still clutched in his hand, Mark stormed into the living room, where Claire was sitting, pretending to read a book, unaware of the storm that was about to hit her. Claire, Mark's voice was low, shaking with a combination of disbelief and fury. I need answers. Now. Her eyes flickered to him, but she didn't seem to understand the gravity in his voice at first. She slowly put the book down, sensing the tension in the air. Mark, what's wrong? She asked, her voice trembling. Her guilt was palpable, but she tried to mask it. His fingers tightened around the phone. You want to tell me what this is about?" he demanded, holding up the phone, the text message clearly visible on the screen. "What is this?" Claire's face paled, her eyes widening with shock. The color drained from her face as the truth she had been hiding for so long finally caught up with her. For a moment, she didn't speak. She couldn't. Mark could see the realization in her eyes, the panic, the fear. It was too late for lies now. He had the truth in his hands. "Mark, I can explain," she stammered, but her words held no weight. Her voice cracked under the pressure. "Please, just listen." But Mark couldn't listen. He didn't want to hear any more excuses. He didn't want to hear her tell him that it was a mistake, that it didn't mean anything. He didn't want to hear about how hard things had been, or how she had struggled. None of that mattered now. The trust was gone. With every passing second, his anger grew stronger. The anger he felt wasn't just because she had cheated, it was because he had been lied to for so long. Every moment, every word she had spoken to him had been a lie. The betrayal, the pain, it was all too much to bear. Mark's heart was heavy, his chest tight, but it was the rage, the burning rage, that was now consuming him. His emotions were unraveling, but so was his ability to reason. The truth had destroyed his sense of control. And then, in that moment, when the silence stretched too long, when Claire tried to reach out to him, to comfort him, Mark did something that would change everything. His hand shot out, his fingers tightening around her arm as he pulled her close. "How could you?" he whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and fury. "How could you betray me like this?" And for years, she didn't respond, her eyes welling with tears. But those tears didn't matter anymore. For Mark, it was no longer just about the affair. It wasn't even about the paternity secret. It was about everything, everything that had been ripped away from him in an instant. His family, his life, his trust, all gone. The anger that Mark felt, the rage that tore through him, wasn't just about betrayal. It was the overwhelming realization that the person he had loved, the person he had shared his life with, had never truly been honest with him. She had built a life of lies. And in that instant, Mark realized he had a choice that would define the rest of his life. It all led to this moment. A single moment that would unravel everything. The hours leading up to that night, they were like any other night. Quiet, ordinary. But behind closed doors, the tension had been building for weeks, months, even years. The cracks in their marriage, cracks Mark had never noticed, or perhaps refused to see, had finally reached their breaking point. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. But for Mark, every passing second felt like a lifetime. The evening began like most evenings. Mark came home after a long day, worn out and ready for the comfort of his family. The house was quiet, eerily so. Where was Claire? Mark had already seen enough to know that there was no turning back. The truth was out, but he couldn't shake the need to confront her, to finally hear the words he had been dreading. The lies, the betrayal, the missing pieces of his life that had been hidden from him for so long. Ohe walked through the front door, the sound of it creaking under his weight as he entered. The house was still. Claire wasn't in the living room, and the faint smell of her perfume lingered in the air. Was she waiting for him? Or was she somewhere else? Mark moved through the house quietly, his footsteps heavy, each one filled with the weight of the impending confrontation. He headed straight for the kitchen. No Claire, no Lucy. A deep sense of foreboding began to settle over him. There was something about the silence of that night. The kind of silence that could only mean one thing, the calm before the storm. What would he do now? The idea of simply leaving, of walking away from the life he had built, was inconceivable. But so was the thought of living with this betrayal, of letting the lie persist. He had to confront her. He needed to hear her say it. Everything was spiraling. The deposit made to the mysterious name, the strange, unexplained charges, and the pattern of secrecy. All of it began to point toward the truth. But it wasn't just about the affair. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered about the hidden life Claire had been leading. The revelation of the paternity secret was a breakthrough. The DNA test results, which had been hidden for years, confirmed the truth. Lucy, Mark's daughter, was not his biological child. Claire had known the truth all along. The questions began to pile up. Did Mark know? How long had Claire kept the secret from him? Was this the final betrayal that drove him to murder? The timeline of the crime slowly began to take shape. According to witness statements and forensic evidence, Mark had arrived home that evening at around 7:30 p.m. Claire had been home, but there was no sign of Lucy. The confrontation, based on the evidence collected, had taken place between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. Mark had apparently confronted Claire about the affair, about the lies, and about the truth of their daughter's paternity. The struggle had been violent and intense, and the fatal blow had been delivered soon after the confrontation turned physical. But the big question remained: where was Mark now? By morning, the police had a clearer understanding of what had transpired. But Mark was nowhere to be found. The authorities immediately issued a warrant for his arrest. The case had gone from a tragic domestic dispute to a full-blown manhunt. At first, the police had their doubts. Was this just a tragic crime of passion? Or was something more insidious at play? Some detectives speculated that Mark had acted out of sheer rage after discovering his wife's affair. Others believed that the paternity revelation, finding out Lucy wasn't his, was the final straw. But the more they dug, the more they realized that the murder was just the tip of the iceberg. The affair had been going on for months, but it was the years of deceit that had built up to the explosion. The lie about Lucy's paternity, the financial secrets, and the emotional isolation Mark had felt, it all culminated in one tragic, violent night. While the police worked through the evidence, the hunt for Mark began in earnest. The media caught wind of the story, and within hours, news outlets were covering the case, speculating on Mark's motives and whereabouts. Social media exploded with rumors and theories about the murder, the affair, and the paternity secret. As the days passed, the tension in the case mounted. The public wanted answers. The detectives, meanwhile, were piecing together the tragic end of a family, one that had fallen apart at the seams. In every crime, there are reasons. Sometimes those reasons are clear. Other times, they are buried so deep beneath layers of emotion, pain, and fear that it takes years to uncover them. In the case of Mark Wilson, the motives behind the murder were as complex as they were tragic. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a culmination of betrayal, rage, and years of pent-up emotion. But what was it that pushed Mark to the brink? What drove a man, a father, to take the life of the woman he had loved? It's the kind of question that plagues investigators, psychologists, and anyone trying to understand the unthinkable. The husband's psychological profile, jealousy, betrayal, anger. Mark's psychology before the murder was not one of a man filled with hatred or violence. At least not outwardly. He was, by all accounts, a hard-working, devoted husband and father, someone who had spent his life trying to protect his family. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. Small fractures in his emotional life that had been ignored, overlooked, and, perhaps, intentionally buried. At the core of his psyche was a deep, consuming fear of inadequacy. He had always believed that his love for Claire was enough, that by providing for her, by offering her a stable life, he could protect her from the world. But the affair, the deceit, shattered that belief in an instant. Mark's feelings of jealousy were not just about losing Claire to another man. They were about losing his identity. For years, his role as a provider and protector had been his core purpose. To discover that Claire, the woman he had built everything for, had secretly rejected him, had chosen someone else, was more than just a blow to his ego. It was an attack on everything he had worked for. The rage that followed was not simply a reaction to the affair. It was a reaction to the loss of control. Mark had believed he understood his place in his family, in his marriage. To have that foundation pulled out from under him left him angry, disillusioned, and emotionally unmoored. Jealousy, in this case, was just the spark that ignited the larger fire of betrayal. And once the flame had started, it spread quickly, consuming everything in its path. The affair, the lies, the stolen moments of Claire's life that he wasn't privy to, each wound Mark deeply. The jealousy turned into a fury he couldn't contain. But there was another layer to this. The discovery that Lucy, his daughter, was not biologically his tore into his soul. Mark had loved her as his own, had poured his heart and life into her. The feeling of betrayal by Claire was compounded by the realization that his love for his daughter had been built on a lie, that he had failed to see the truth. He had failed to protect his daughter. And the weight of that failure, the guilt, was something that no amount of rage could wash away. But what about Claire? What drove her to deceive Mark, to hide the truth about Lucy, and to maintain the secret for so many years? At the heart of Claire's actions was a sense of deep loneliness. Despite the seemingly perfect life Mark had provided, Claire felt emotionally disconnected, unfulfilled. She had tried, for years, to bury those feelings. But like most buried emotions, they didn't stay hidden forever. Her affair wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about emotional neglect. She had turned to someone else not because she wanted to destroy her family, but because she needed to feel wanted. She needed to feel desired, something she hadn't felt in a long time. But the affair wasn't her only secret. The true betrayal was the paternity of their daughter. The truth that Lucy was not Mark's biological child was something Claire had kept hidden from him for years, perhaps out of guilt, fear, or a misguided sense of loyalty. To the family she had built, psychologists often described the need to conceal painful truths as a survival mechanism, one that Claire may have unconsciously developed to preserve the fragile harmony of her life. Perhaps she believed that revealing Lucy's true paternity would tear the family apart irreparably. Or perhaps she justified it to herself, telling herself that Mark loved Lucy just as much as his own, that his bond with her could never be broken by a mere biological fact. But in doing so, she set into motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy the very life she had worked so hard to protect. She created a lie that was too big, too complicated to ever stay hidden forever. And once that lie was revealed, everything she had built came crashing down. Claire's emotional complexity is not just about infidelity. It's about the need for validation and love, the feeling of suffocation in her own life, and the deep-seated guilt she carried. She wasn't a villain, but in her desperation, her actions led to a tragedy that no one could have predicted: the daughter's role, innocence, unawareness of the secret. And then there was Lucy, the innocent child who, in all of this, had no idea what was going on around her. Lucy's role in the tragedy was, tragically, one of ignorance. 9 years old, Lucy was at an age where the world felt simple and straightforward. She loved her father, loved her mother. She didn't know the complexity of adult relationships, the secrets they kept. She didn't know that the love and care she received from Mark, her father, was built on a lie, psychologically. Children in Lucy's position often form their identities based on the love and approval of their parents. The idea that Mark might not be her father was an abstract concept to her, something she couldn't even begin to understand. Her world was made of simple truths. Mark was her dad, and Claire was her mom. But as the events unfolded, Lucy's innocence would be swept away. The emotional trauma that would come from learning the truth, from having her family torn apart, would leave scars far deeper than anyone could have predicted. Her unawareness, her inability to comprehend the full weight of her family's collapse, was perhaps the most tragic part of this story. She was just a child, thrust into an adult world of secrets, lies, and violence that she could never have imagined. Dr. Karen Fisher, a clinical psychologist, explains that betrayal trauma is one of the most profound forms of emotional harm a person can experience. When someone who is deeply trusted, like a spouse, betrays that trust, it can cause deep psychological damage. For Mark, the discovery of the affair was just the beginning. The deeper wound came from the realization that his love for his daughter wasn't built on truth, but on a lie. Mark's psychological state shifted from betrayal to something much darker. He was not only angry with Claire, but also with himself. The failure of his own perception, the fact that he didn't see what was happening around him, led to an overwhelming sense of guilt, which only added fuel to the fire of his rage. Dr. Lucas Green, a criminologist, offers further insight. Crimes like this often come from a perfect storm of psychological factors: the need for control, the profound loss of trust, and the inability to cope with deep emotional wounds. In this case, Mark's crime wasn't purely driven by rage. It was an emotional and psychological breakdown, and the effects of that trauma were too great for him to overcome. Rage, betrayal trauma, and family breakdown. When we look at Mark's actions, it's important to consider the role of betrayal trauma. The feeling of betrayal, the sudden shift from love to distrust, can cause a person to lose their sense of reality. Mark wasn't just angry, he was devastated. And for Claire, her actions were not about malice, but about survival. She had built a life of lies, a life that had become her identity. But in the end, that identity collapsed, leaving behind only the shattered remnants of a family that, as for Lucy, her innocence would be forever lost. Her world, once filled with love and security, would be torn apart by the secrets her parents kept. In the aftermath, she would be left to pick up the pieces of a life that was no longer whole. In the wake of Claire's murder, the world Mark had once known began to unravel at an unimaginable speed. The calm suburban streets, the warm family gatherings, the carefully constructed life, all were replaced by flashing sirens, news cameras, and the cold reality of a criminal investigation that would turn Mark's world upside down. Mark's whereabouts remained unknown for days after the crime. The authorities had issued a warrant for his arrest, but Mark had vanished. His car was found abandoned a few miles from the house, and the search intensified. The police feared the worst, that Mark might try to flee the country, that he might be out there somewhere, hiding in plain sight. The man who had been a husband, a father, a provider, was now a fugitive. But then, for days after the murder, Mark was found. He had been holed up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, disheveled and broken. There were no signs of a struggle, only the hollow look in his eyes, the weight of what he had done finally sinking in. The police arrested him without incident, and Mark was brought in for questioning. The interrogation room was cold, sterile, and unforgiving. The walls seemed to close in on Mark as the detectives sat across from him, their expressions stern, their questions sharp. For hours, Mark remained silent, his head bowed, his hands shaking. They tried everything to break him, to make him talk. But at first, he said nothing. He couldn't. The gravity of what he had done, the guilt, the confusion, it paralyzed him. But eventually, the truth came spilling out. That Mark's confession was a slow unraveling. He spoke in fragments about Claire, the affair, the lies, the betrayal. He admitted to everything: the confrontation, the rage, the violence that followed. But there was one thing Mark could never explain, something he could never justify: the murder of his wife. "I didn't mean to do it," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt her. I loved her. I couldn't control it. The anger, the betrayal, it took over. I never thought it would go this far." His voice cracked as he continued, but the confession was clear. There were no alibis, no excuses. Just a man broken by the weight of his own emotions. The confession was the turning point, the point when the full scope of the crime became undeniable. Mark's words, his admission, sealed his fate. In the months that followed, the case made headlines. The story of a man driven to murder by betrayal captivated the nation. Mark Wilson, once a respected businessman, was now the face of a tragedy, a man who had lost everything in a fit of rage. The prosecution's case was clear. Mark had acted out of jealousy, anger, and deep emotional trauma. They painted a picture of a man who, upon discovering his wife's affair and the truth about his daughter's paternity, had been consumed by rage. It was a crime of passion, one that could have been avoided if not for the emotional volatility that Mark had experienced. But the defense wasn't so simple. They argued that Mark's actions had been the result of extreme emotional distress, what they called betrayal trauma. The affair, the lies about his daughter, the years of emotional neglect, they argued it all contributed to his breakdown. Mark wasn't in his right mind when he killed Claire. He had snapped under the weight of his shattered life. The prosecution leaned heavily on the violence of the crime. The brutality with which Mark had murdered Claire was undeniable, and they focused on the fact that Mark had planned the confrontation. He had been aware of the affair for days before he acted, meaning the murder was not a spur-of-the-moment act. They used Mark's own confession to show that he had intended to cause harm. That it wasn't just a crime of passion, but a calculated and violent response to years of deceit. That defense's strategy, the defense, on the other hand, argued that Mark's actions were not premeditated. They contended that the discovery of Claire's betrayal and the truth about his daughter's paternity had sent him into a psychological tailspin. They brought in experts who testified about the effects of betrayal, trauma, how the emotional shock of discovering such deep lies could push someone to the brink of violent breakdown. They painted Mark not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man pushed beyond his limits, a man who had lost everything he had ever known. After weeks of testimony, the trial reached its conclusion. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the arguments, the emotional trauma, the rage, and the evidence. Finally, the verdict came. Mark Wilson was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury had taken into account the emotional distress he had experienced, but they also recognized that the act was one of violence that could not be ignored. The sentencing took place just a few days later. Mark stood in front of the judge, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. The weight of the moment was suffocating. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. There were no cheers, no applause, only the quiet, somber sound of the gavel as it struck, sealing Mark's fate. The public reaction was mixed. Some believed Mark deserved everything he got. After all, he had taken a life, and that was not something that could be easily forgiven, no matter the circumstances. Others, however, felt sympathy for him. They understood how deep betrayal could cut, how the collapse of a family could drive a man to the brink. Social media was divided. There were countless debates on whether Mark was a victim of his emotions or a cold-blooded killer. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a man who had lost control in the heat of a devastating emotional storm. Others saw him as a murderer who used his pain as an excuse for violence. The case became a flashpoint for discussions on infidelity, betrayal, and the fragility of the human psyche. Experts on domestic violence, emotional trauma, and criminal psychology weighed in, providing insights into how such a tragedy could unfold in a seemingly normal family. In the years that followed, Mark's defense team filed an appeal. They argued that the sentence was too harsh, given the emotional trauma he had suffered. They pointed to the emotional breakdown Mark had endured, contending that the sentencing failed to take his mental state into full consideration. The appeal process dragged on for years, with Mark's supporters continuing to argue that he was a victim of emotional trauma who had never intended to kill his wife. However, the appeal was ultimately denied. The court reaffirmed the original sentence, despite the legal setbacks. Mark's story continued to be a subject of discussion, both in the media And within the criminal justice system, the aftermath of Claire's murder was not just felt within the walls of Mark and Claire's home. It spread far beyond, touching the lives of family, friends, and a community that had once looked at this family as the perfect example of suburban life in the days that followed the trial. The streets that had once been filled with laughter and light were now quiet, silent reminders of the tragedy that had unfolded within their midst. The shockwaves of Mark's actions rippled through the community, changing everything in its wake. But the impact of the crime was not just emotional. It was societal. Family members, community, and friends' reactions for Mark's family. The fallout was immediate and heartbreaking. His parents, once proud of their son's success, now faced the harsh reality of having a son convicted of murder. They didn't know how to react, how to respond to the world that saw them through the lens of their son's crime. The questions came fast and furious. What went wrong? How could a loving husband do such a thing? They weren't the only ones asking those questions. Claire's family, too, was torn apart. Her parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, were left to cope with the pain of not just her death, but the revelation of the lies she had kept hidden. They struggled to come to terms with the fact that the woman they had known and loved had been living in secrecy for so long. The grief was compounded by the confusion. How could they have missed the signs? Why hadn't they seen that their daughter was suffering, that her life was being built on deception? The loss of Claire left a hole in her family's hearts, one that would never be filled. Her brothers and sisters, too, were forced to reckon with the implications of her betrayal, not just to Mark, but to her family. They had questions that would never be answered, things they would never understand. But what of the community? At first, there was disbelief. People couldn't comprehend how a seemingly stable family could descend into such violence. This wasn't the story of a troubled household or a history of domestic violence. It was a story of betrayal so profound. It shook the very fabric of the community. Neighbors who had once waved at Claire from across the street now found themselves questioning everything they had thought they knew. How could they have not seen the signs? How could they have missed the tension that had been building between Claire and Mark? The community, once close-knit and trusting, was now left with an uncomfortable truth. Deception could live behind any closed door. The ripple effect of Claire's death was felt far beyond the small suburban neighborhood where the family had lived. News of the crime spread quickly, and the media descended on the case with a voracious appetite. People across the country were glued to their televisions, captivated by the twists and turns of the trial, the psychological drama behind the motivations, and the shocking nature of the crime. But it wasn't just the media frenzy that left a mark, it was the public's response. There were debates, heated discussions about betrayal, emotional trauma, and the psychological limits of the human mind. Some saw Mark as a tragic figure, consumed by his emotions and pushed to the edge by a series of painful revelations. Others saw him as a cold-blooded killer, someone who could not control his rage. Social media exploded with opinions, theories, and personal reflections. People shared their own stories of betrayal, of broken trust, of the pain of discovering that a loved one had lied to them. Mark's crime became a symbol of the destructive power of secrets and deception and the emotional damage that can result from betrayal. The case became more than just a tragedy. It became a cautionary tale, one that forced people to reconsider the fragility of trust, the hidden lives we all lead, and the emotional scars that remain long after the truth is uncovered. How betrayal and deception escalated to tragedy in the months that followed the trial. People began to reflect on the deeper lessons learned from Mark and Claire's story. One of the most poignant lessons was the devastating impact that long-buried secrets could have. Betrayal, no matter how carefully hidden, will eventually come to light. And when it does, the consequences can be catastrophic. Mark's actions were driven by an overwhelming sense of betrayal, not just from Claire's affair, but from the realization that his entire life had been built on a lie. That realization sent him spiraling into rage, and in a moment of emotional chaos, he took the life of the woman he had loved. But even more tragic was the fact that Claire had kept these secrets from Mark for years. The emotional toll of her own guilt, the isolation she felt in her marriage, had caused her to make decisions that would ultimately lead to her death. She had chosen to deceive the man she had once vowed to love, thinking she was protecting him, but in the end, the truth was far more destructive than she could have ever imagined. The story of Mark and Claire is a reminder that emotional pain, when left unaddressed, can lead to unthinkable consequences. It is a reminder that trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild, and that the truth, however painful, is always better than the lie. Reflection on domestic violence, trust, and secrets. This case also forced society to reconsider how we understand domestic violence. Though Mark's crime wasn't one of premeditated violence or abuse, the emotional violence that led up to it was just as devastating. Betrayal, in its many forms, can be as damaging as physical harm. The psychological trauma that results from years of secrecy, deceit, and emotional neglect can drive people to commit acts they never thought possible. Mark's story is also a reflection of the fragility of trust within a relationship. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and when it is destroyed, it can create a ripple effect that destroys everything in its path. But perhaps the most tragic lesson of all is the impact on Lucy, the daughter who was caught in the middle of her parents' secrets. She would never be able to understand why her family had fallen apart. She would never be able to comprehend the magnitude of the lies that had been kept from her. Her innocence was lost in a moment of violence and betrayal, and her life would never be the same. Now, we turn the spotlight to you, our viewers. After everything you've just heard, after diving deep into the mind of Mark Wilson and the tragedy that unfolded in his home, one question remains. Could this have been prevented? Mark's actions, though deeply emotional, were driven by anger, betrayal, and the crushing weight of a secret that consumed him. But in the face of such betrayal, was there another way he could have reacted? Could the situation have been handled differently? Or was his fate sealed the moment Claire's lies came to light? We want to hear from you. Do you believe that Mark's rage was understandable? Or do you think there was a breaking point that he should have avoided? Could he have chosen a path of understanding, of forgiveness, despite the monumental betrayal he discovered? And what about Claire? Do you think she was entirely responsible for the tragedy that unfolded? Or was she also a victim of her own guilt, emotional neglect, and the choices she made long before the confrontation? Would things have turned out differently if she had come clean earlier? What would have happened if she hadn't kept Lucy's secret, if she hadn't turned to someone else for emotional support? As we reflect on these questions, let's talk about the bigger picture, the family that was destroyed. We saw Mark's journey from a devoted father to a man filled with rage and despair, Claire's hidden life and its devastating consequences, and the innocent bystander in all of this, Lucy, a young child caught in the wake of her parents' secrets. But what about the hidden secret Claire kept, the one that was never fully revealed? What would you have done if you were in Mark's shoes? Was there any turning back from the moment the truth was revealed? Leave your thoughts and theories on alternate outcomes in the comments below. That if you found yourself captivated by Mark and Claire's tragic tale, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the shocking cases we have lined up for you. That we have more true crime stories coming your way. Stories of betrayal, of lies, of tragic twists that will leave you questioning everything.